It is indeed a joy to be here with you today. What a marathon it has been. I understand it has been 12 hours at least. You've been listening to such impactful conversation. We are going to be your dose of caffeine right now. Get your coffee, get your tea, figuratively speaking, because we have got some incredible speakers to really drive home some of the crises that we face. I do not need to reiterate the women's and girls' issues, the fight for equality that have just been so perfectly brought to your attention in the previous discussion. But there's also, of course, the worries about war, about climate, of course, about spending power, inflation, the erosion of your own wealth. All of this at a time where we look to not only government, public, but private sector too. And this is what this conversation is going to be all about, bringing companies to bear. How can for-profit institutions really exercise their power, their ability to innovate and bring along with them their stakeholders, their employees, their investor base, and of course, their customers? We've got some really forward-thinking leaders here with us on this discussion today. Executives, of course, from across the business world, both in Europe, in the US, in Africa. We've also got academics aplenty across Latin America as well, just to really think about how these for-profit businesses can make their mark. I want to introduce now our panel, what is called More Than Just Profits, the impact we want from the private sector. Siobhan Daniel is with us, Group Director of CMG Sri Lanka and the leader of the Gamada social movement. We've got Dr. Bjorn Sorensen, he's the Chief Executive Officer of Siemens in Denmark, and Francine Katsoudas, Executive Vice President and Chief People Policy and Purpose Officer of Cisco. I'm very pleased to say we're also going to have plenty of discussions from really from the academic world, also from the not-profit world. We've got Dr. Ricardo Alonso Valen Salinas, he's going to be joining us. We've also, of course, got Professor Dr. Mohammed Naveed coming from Pakistan. Errol Nobab is going to be joining us as well from Namibia. We've got Professor Bernardo Lishinsky is going to be joining us as well from Argentina, as well as Charles Boateng, Head of Private Sector Development at the African Center for Economic Transformation. But first and foremost, as we await for Mr. Daniel Siobhan to join us, I want to start with Fran, with you. Good morning.
I'm actually already online.
Oh, great. Siobhan has joined us. I'm pleased to welcome you. And please, Mr. Daniel, let's talk about first and foremost how you uniquely think a for-profit business can answer in any way social needs right now. What unique aspect can private sector bring to some of these global concerns?
Sure. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be with all of you. It's a real honor. I'd like to say thank you to my dear friend Dino for thinking of me. I also want to very quickly apologize for the terrible setting that I'm in right now. I'm actually at the India versus Pakistan cricket match, for which broadcast rights. I could easily turn the camera around and show you all of you the cricket match. I won't do that, but pardon me for all of that. But thank you for the question, Caroline. It's actually really a groundbreaking time for us in a sense, because if you really think about it, everything, including politics and the private sector, has been in a sense Ubered, in the sense that I think particularly the private sector has to rethink its approach towards its customers, its employees, and communities in which they're based in. So it's not enough anymore for the private sector particularly to pretend as though they are islands and devoid of any connection or engagement with communities that they're in. So just to give you a quick example, something that the organization that I'm involved in, which owns the largest media network in Sri Lanka, something that we've done is about 10 years ago, we decided that instead of simply reporting on news, we would also engage with communities and try to resolve some of the problems that we would traditionally be reporting on. That was a complete breakaway from traditional journalism where one is expected to stay away from the story. But 10 years on, today, we're the biggest rural development movement in the country. And that has not only meant that many communities, the lives of these people have been changed forever, but it also means that the organization has also evolved and become one of Sri Lanka's most successful. And so it's sort of an evolution that is not a choice anymore. It is absolutely essential that it is done. So those are my initial thoughts, and very happy to share anything as we go on.
To that point, can you describe any specific instances where you have, as a private company, brought to bear real change within the community? What particular areas of the development goals have you decided have been yours to own and to drive change in?
Yeah, so in Sri Lanka, it's interesting because we have levels of poverty which are massively undocumented. The levels of inequality is something that is really swept under the carpet often. And what we've done is we've noticed that there is a large sector of the Sri Lankan populace that is often ignored, in a sense, by different levels of politics. So what we've done is we are able to collate information from different parts of the island, and using that information, we're also then we act as a platform for ordinary Sri Lankans to be involved in the movement where they contribute whatever they can. We take responsibility to resolving a problem. So let's say, for example, clean water, which is a huge problem in 24 of Sri Lanka's 25 districts, access to clean water. This in a country which has 106 beautiful rivers flowing out into the ocean. So it's really a bizarre kind of a situation. So what we do is once we've identified a community which needs clean water, we then ask basically ordinary Sri Lankans to support our efforts into providing them with clean water. Ordinary Sri Lankans contribute what they can. We put the project together and voila, you have a project. So we do hundreds and hundreds of these projects. So in a sense, it's almost Ubering or democratizing humanitarianism across Sri Lanka. And this movement is being studied by Brown University, Oxford University, universities around the world, because it's a movement that has truly broken the rules, as it were, for the private sector engagement with community in Sri Lanka. I hope I've answered the question.
I love that you bring not only to bear in that answer what's happening in the private sector, what you call ordinary but utterly extraordinary people within Sri Lanka to help as well as academia as well. And this is exactly what this conference, exactly what this discussion is all about, how private can meet public, can meet the think tanks as well. Let's just move on to Francine for a minute here, because Fran, Cisco is so focused on democratization as well. And I think in particular, your democratization, your equality lens at Cisco has really come through the digital divide in particular, the examples where you've integrated your own Cisco strategy and tried to implement it for the good, not just of those that can afford, but for everyone. In the previous years, can you just give us some examples, Fran, of where Cisco has managed to make real impact on bringing, communication to absolutely everyone?
Yeah, happy to be here and talk about something so important. And so what I would say, Caroline, is that first of all, for Cisco, what we recognized years ago is that our technology is a big part of how you actually address the digital divide. And that the more that people are connected, it impacts their ability to work, to be educated, to get healthcare. But something that was really important for us was about 3 years ago as a company, we intersected our business strategy directly with our purpose, and we created the purpose statement to power an inclusive future for all. The reason that I start here is that move allowed us to put purpose front and center together with our business. And I think for us, it was important to not have this on the side as something good that we do, but to really build it into the cadence that we have as a company. So we take that purpose statement and we work to architect how do we show up to that purpose across everything that we do. Digital divide is the biggest focus for us. And the way that we address that is through education predominantly. And so over the last 25 years, we have trained 17.5 million students on digital skills and providing them with the certifications that allow them to get jobs at companies around the world. That is something that is so important, and we know it's a big part of how we address the digital divide. The other thing that we've done in this space is we've been opening up these edge centers across the African continent where we bring entrepreneurs. The last one that we did was focused on women in innovation. We bring them together, give them a space where they can start up their companies, give them some of the mentoring and the technology to allow them to grow. And what we know from a Cisco perspective is when they're successful, they're also going to be buyers of technology. And so there's something in this too from a Cisco perspective. And I think we have to be okay with the fact that we're going to do good for the world and good for business. I think we've been hesitant to say that in the past. And then the other place that I would say that there's a huge opportunity is how we really look at everything from a sustainability and environmental perspective as well, because what we know is that this too creates opportunity for innovators, entrepreneurs. We have a $100 million grant from the Cisco Foundation where we're funding early stage innovators and startups, knowing that when this technology comes to scale, it's going to solve some of the biggest issues that we have in the world. And so our approach is really to balance this element of scale and then I think connection. Today at Cisco, 85% of our employees give back to the community. We think that's pretty amazing. We give our employees 2 weeks of paid time off to dedicate their time to anything that they care about. And in doing so, and I heard Mr. Daniel use the word movement, I think we create a movement for our employees. And it's something that's really important to them. And so for us, it's the top down, the bottoms up, the side to side around how we show up to the community.
It really feels like certainly one of your stakeholders of your employees, it's a no-brainer. You're bringing in your talent is passionate. It's interesting that you say we now need to start admitting that you can do good, but you can also do good for your own profit, for your own business, for your own bottom line. Has that ever been a stumbling block with the stakeholders that are your investors? Were they ever questioning this alignment of really wanting to do good as a business, not only good for the investor base, or have you found that that's changed in recent years?
I think it's changing, Caroline. I think the biggest stumbling block was for us. And there were points where I think there were projects that we could see there was a business opportunity and we would hold because we would say, well, this is more about the community. And I think over the last couple of years, we basically said, you know what, we want to have a model to do both. And so a great example of that is we have a program called Country Digital Acceleration, where we work with 50 countries around the world, about 1,600 projects. Many of these projects are really around how we address the digital divide, how we help countries create, as an example, the platform to provide citizens with healthcare. And that's a really beautiful example of something that is a good business opportunity for us, but yields amazing impact to the community. And so I think our investors and stakeholders are open. I think it was something that we actually had to start to get over from a company perspective and start to measure our impact as well.
Well said. It's all about the data. And in this moment, it's about measurability and the impact of this conversation. And I want to remind everyone who's listening that we're joyful you're with us. Early morning in California, morning here in New York, but across Africa and Latin America. Keep making your voices heard. Keep sharing about this conversation. I know that you're asking your questions as well, and we cannot wait to hear from you. So keep on the conversation around this global town hall. And to bring into this conversation now, I'm very pleased to welcome, of course, Dr. Bjørn. Bjørn, it is wonderful to have some time with you today over in Denmark. And what strategies in particular, as Siemens, have you seen in terms of encouraging other private companies to follow your way? Have you seen that by making a stand, by taking big steps, by making impact, others have said, goodness, it's our time to shine as well. We wanted to be doing what you're doing.
Yes, thanks a lot for the question. And by the way, a big thanks for participating here. I must say that in Siemens, we really like this topic, more than just profit and how we make an impact from the private sector. Before I answer your question, I would like to put in that Siemens is more than 175 years old. And our founder, Werner von Siemens, he actually said 175 years ago that I will not sell the future for the short-term profit. And that gets a little bit the same thing that you have to think about societies and you have to think about the future. And in Siemens, we have actually worked a lot with it. First, how can we make an impact? And then, of course, also how can we make an impact together with our partners and our customers? And we actually formulated a global strategy. How could we roll it out? And the name was Degree. And Degree was the D was decarbonization, where we think we have a big role to play in companies together with societies to work hard to make the maximum plus 1.5. And the decarbonization, not only us, is also for our customers and partners and societies. And perhaps there our role is even better than if we sell goals to net zero, which we will. And then we have the E for ethics. And we think that if you want to roll it out, you need to have an organization where you live up to ethic standards. And then you have the governance part, that is the G part. And that is, of course, business conduct guidelines, where we make sure that we live up to the societies we are in, the rules and the regulations. And then the R, and I think the R actually is, this discussion is super important, that is resource efficiency. Because we cannot keep having a world where we're having such a high burn rate on the capacity we have on Earth. We have to find a way where it's more sustainable, where we use less resources than we are able to reproduce on the Earth, and perhaps even better that we use less resources than the Earth is to reproduce. And then the E, you mentioned it in the beginning, Caroline, about the equity. That we want to work with diversity. We want actually to be in the societies where Siemens reflect the societies we are in, and then we work a lot with inclusion also. So all kind of persons, no matter where they come from and the background and gender and religion, feel that they're welcome and would like to work here. And then the last one in this global program to try to impact is employability. And that comes a little bit back to what Francine also was saying about this, that we have more than 300,000 people working for Siemens. So we have a big responsibility to make sure that they are trained and that they develop, we call it growth mindset. So they actually also develop this way. So you can say that we have made a program where we try to impact the society and our partners and our customers, and of course also ourselves.
And what's interesting is Francine also mentioned measurability, data, impact. And that's something that really has changed in the last few years, perhaps. There have been indices by Standard & Poor's. Of course, the private sector have come rushing forward with ways to try and track the impact that companies are making. And in some ways, sell them as an investing opportunity. I just think of the exchange-traded funds that have been built around the so-called ESG, whether or not that's become a politicized term. But Dr. Bjørn, from your perspective, when Bloomberg has an index on to show you whether there's gender equality within a business or whether there are ESG ETFs you can be part of, has that driven change amid your business community to realize that measurability suddenly is of interest to the broader community?
Thanks, Caroline. Yes, I think it is, and I think we as companies and as society need to set targets to change things. It doesn't matter just to talk about it. You have to go to be net zero, or you have to set targets for where you want to go with gender equality in your company and this, and without these kind of ESG targets, then by the way, now I'm sitting in Denmark, and Denmark is a part of the European Union, and many of you probably know that the European Union actually is now going in to do a lot of ESG reporting mandatory for companies. And you can always discuss, this is a lot of additional work, but on the other hand, I'm really convinced that if you want to drive ESG, you also need to set targets in the companies, and you have to be measured on them, and you also have to report on them. And I think that is the way also to drive these things. So, and I'm actually happy that ESG is coming so high up in the general, in the talking in the world, and I think that will be, you cannot as a company just, coming back to, you have to be more than just a profit, and there I think the target setting for ESG is a good way to do this.
It is. It really feels like a moment where it has to be about, building brand equity and business equity, and ultimately not just about profitability anymore, but how you bring a better world to all of your stakeholders, whoever they may be. I'm really excited. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, just a fast comment on that one. And I think, it's not like, you have to be relevant, and it's not like, so because doing good, making a better tomorrow, you can still have a good profit. So it's not like, there is some contradiction between these two. And I think that is important to understand. I think if you are not taking ESG and seriously and the impact you're making, then I think you cannot be profitable in the long run. So
well said. These things are mutually exclusive. And to that point, we want to turn our attention to not only the for-profit businesses, but also how you're intersecting with the world of well, the NGOs, the universities, the think tanks, and we're really excited at this moment to bring in some discussants that we have lined up for you from all over the world. And we're just going to hear from the first two of them right now, because I'm very pleased to say coming to us from Colombia is Dr. Ricardo Alonso Bayen Salinas. He's Head of International Relations Departments at Universidad del CNU. We'll also have Professor Mohammed Naveed, Professor of Finance and former Dean of Management Science at Bavaria University in Pakistan. But first, Dr. Ricardo, please just bring us some of your thoughts that you've already been sort of aligning with some of the points raised by our for-profit speakers. Just bring us your thoughts, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me in this session. It's a pleasure to join this stage with our speakers. And I think it's really interested how we can contribute to sustainable development for humanity that is paradoxically increasingly threatened by our...
Dr. Ricardo, Dr. Ricardo, I'm just going to step in. You're taking some hits to your line. Your internet isn't perfect right now. So I'm just going to go to Dr. Naveed, and hopefully your internet will come back a little bit in a moment. So Professor Naveed, if you could just take it away from Pakistan with some of your thoughts, and then we'll return to Dr. Ricardo.
Thank you so much, Carolina, for providing this opportunity to bring my thoughts towards this very provoking session that we. I want to be very specific towards what's happening towards the orientation of the private sector. Private sector that is basically being developed with the orientation of financial returns, I would say. Now, we have to come up with a very design thinking. I'm using the word design since the private equity or it's a public equity. We speak about the capital markets capitalization or we speak about the venture capital. End of the day, we have to bring a design model where we have to engage the capital markets alignment with the SDGs, Agenda 2030. So this is one of the thought. When I see in particular what's happening in my country, I need to find out my capital markets, my private equity models, they are working in their own directions, and companies, they are have a sense of the economic development. They're contributing a lot, but at the same time, we have to make them more responsible. And it's a very design thinking process. And I want to bring some thought for the panelists that is more towards the significance of the financial governance. If I see the corporate governance, the board compositions of the private companies, I need to find out we basically lacking a representation of the social minds. They are going to bring some social justice. So I would say the board compositions, we have to bring a balance of the social justice and we have to bring a balance of the financial motivations as well. But at the same time, when we bring our thoughts that is coming towards your thoughts, that is a measurement of the sustainability. ESG, this is the buzzword. We are moving towards the green financing. We are moving towards a green economic development. But end of the day, we have to be on the one page. What is the measure of the sustainability? Sustainable Accounting Standard Boards that has provided the standard for that. UNPRI that is setting a principle for the responsible investments. But the companies, they sometimes find what is a standard rubric, where we have to be localized according to the quality of their financial reporting. And final thought, that is moving towards the entire sustainability drive that is based on DIB. Diversity, equality, inclusion, and belongingness. I think we also have to align the concept of this DIB with the economic and financial democracy. Now, I am giving the thoughts of the democracy that is the more towards the social, economic, and financial inclusion. So if by design, if we can bring the DIB, we can bring this ESG that is being aligned with the capital, the markets and the equity markets. So what we can do, we can bring the demonstration that is more measurable and that is adding more inclusiveness towards the uplift of the social and economic development. So it's a very quick thought from my side.
Perfect set of questions. Dr. Naveed, Professor Naveed seems to be really asking about how we can align financial governance, how we formalize that, how we ensure that basically companies have the right board composition, that ESG doesn't just become a buzzword. We will return to our speakers in a moment for their thoughts on that particular set of questions. But now let's return to Dr. Ricardo Alonso Bayen Salinas. Dr. Ricardo, your thoughts, please, and some questions for our speakers.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And I hope you can
I'm
listen well. Able to say
I'm so sorry, but
plays a crucial role in human development.
this internet, I'm so sorry. We're still struggling to hear you, Dr. Ricardo. What we'll do is we'll return to our speakers to react to Dr. Naveed, and hopefully we can come back to you in a moment. I will, hopefully we can reset your internet connection. So firstly, let us first go back to some of our speakers. And Fran, I want to turn to you first on what was being raised by Professor Naveed. How has America managed to perhaps align its boards, its businesses with, and its financial governance with the aims of sustainable development goals, for example? Do you think that has been formalized, or has it been for businesses to privately align themselves?
I would say that at this moment it's probably a little bit more on the private side, Caroline. I think what's interesting is when you're a global company, you adhere to the guardrails and guidelines that you see as an example across the EU. I do think that makes us better. I would say that what we've seen across the US is really a push to having a level of diversity on boards, which I think has been really good for us. I think as we look at ESG, the more and more that there is commonality, or in some cases regulation, about what that looks like, I think that's great. I think as I was listening, I think what we have to balance is targets and plans. And so on something like, environmental sustainability efforts, many companies are making their net zero commitments, which is good, or their carbon reduction commitments. But having the science and the planning to validate that we're getting there, I think is absolutely critical. And so as you may know, Cisco has an SPTI approved plan, and that's meaningful for us. That means that from now until 2040, when we hit net zero, we're going to be able to just check our progress all the way through. And so anyway, my sense is that it's a little bit more ad hoc at the moment, but I do see companies like Siemens leading the way or leaning in, which is good. And then we listen, we get inspired by that work, and we take on more.
And you passed it over to Siemens. So Dr. Björn, your perspective on how you've seen perhaps the second stage of what Dr. Naveed was saying is how you define standardization, how you ensure that you sort of ESG doesn't become some sort of buzzword. Dr. Björn, are you on? You might be still mute.
I think I was muted again. Now I'm here. I hope you can hear me.
There you are.
Good. Thanks for the question. And Francine, by the way, thanks for the nice wording about Siemens. We actually have a lot of really talented people coming from Cisco and now working in Siemens. So also thanks for that, by the way. Now, but coming back to the question, as I think a little bit also what Francine is saying, that you need here also, for example, you need to work with science-based targets. And you need here to make sure, like we talk about when we talk about the CO2 emissions and decarbonization, we talk about that the greenwashing is totally out of the picture, and you have to be sure. And I think that is in all it as and you really have to live it, and you have to set targets and goals, and you also have to be able to measure it. And that could be with gender equality, that could be with a lot of these measures. And of course, the good example is with many companies have this net zero based targets, and many companies is also going in to make it science based. But I think here that and I think also there will be a push here as both from the society and both from the governmental organizations, but hopefully also, by the way, at the customers and the consumer side, that they really can trust that if a company say that we work with this, then they also do it.
Well said. But walk the walk. They just talk the talk and show us the data and
Exactly.
prove it. And I'm going to give Dr. Ricardo just a few more moments to sign back on, and we're going to be hearing from Siobhan in a moment again when we come to the next set of our discussants, because now I think it's time to move on to some other incredible places in the world, because this is a global town hall and a global discussion. And therefore, we want to be hearing some thoughts and indeed some questions coming from Dr. Errol Nolwab. He is the Vice Chancellor of Namibian University of Science and Technology. So coming from Namibia is Dr. Nolwab. We also have Professor Bernardo Lashinsky, Director of Business and Administration School at Universidad Nacional de Tres de Febrero. He's from Argentina. He's also the former alternate Executive Director for Argentina at the IMF. And Charles Woetang is going to be is joining us, Head of Private Sector Development at the African Center of Economic Transformation from Ghana. So, Dr. Errol, please do start us off from Namibia, what your thoughts are, what your questions are for our panelists.
Well, thank you so much, Caroline, for this opportunity, and also to the panelists for their insightful and very interesting perspective on the subject matter. I want to slightly deviate from the global level focus and focus on the unjustified socio-economic impact inflicted on the continent of Africa as a consequence of the issues that we are discussing today, specifically around the issue of climate change. The panelists really set out a very strong case, and we've now firmly established that the private sector has an integral role to play in tackling these complex global challenges. However, if we momentarily just focus on sub-Saharan Africa, the complexity is even more profound. We are observing increase in capital flight from Africa. We are still observing increase in natural resource depletion. We are still observing increase in brain drain, largely driven by global trade imbalances. So here is my question, Caroline. In the midst of the digital transformation and innovations like AI, how can the private sector support the efforts of universities to drive a more justified and more inclusive transition to a decarbonized economy, whilst we are upskilling and reskilling our workforce and redress the growing imbalances and unemployment related social challenges? And then secondly, Caroline, recently Namibia emerged as a leading global hub for hydrogen economy, especially the production and the supply of green hydrogen. And I'm interested to know, how can the private sector in the global north support the efforts of small economies like Namibia? Cheers.
Fascinating. So just to reiterate, we'll be going to our panelists to understand how really the private sector can support universities to ensure that we don't have this sort of brain drain, of leaching of capital, of resources, of talent coming from particularly sub-Saharan Africa, and instead be able to have a more equitable way of ensuring, particularly in the world of AI, that we have a more just way in which we can continue to build. And I think that'd be a great one, particularly for Fran. And I'm also thinking about the hydrogen expertise that you speak of and how certain companies are adopting that. Before we go to our speakers, let's now hear from Professor Bernardo Lashinsky, who I think has some points and some questions to raise. Professor Lashinsky, if you want to unmute. Are you there, Professor Lashinsky?
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you to SPC of Indonesian Global Citizen for organizing this global town hall, and thanks to former speakers. I agree with the description of this session. There are a lot of challenges that people around the world face every day. Among them, climate crisis worsens. Argentina, my country, has lost this year 25% of exports due to the most severe drought suffered in the country history, causing increasing food prices, high inflation, as well as the poverty rate and extreme poverty increase. At the global level, the situation of many middle and low-income countries is not very different. They are heavily indebted, and sustainable development goals, SDGs, are also at risk. At the same time, SDGs should be implemented in an integrated and holistic way through poverty eradication, reducing climate change impact, and conservation of biological diversity. In all these issues, private sector participation is key. In this regard, the private sector can participate in the second SDGs United Nations Summit to be held in New York during this month, and in the leaders' dialogues as well. ESG's regulation, as Francine said, are welcome. The private sector can contribute to collectively addressing debt vulnerabilities by participating in the common framework for debt treatment of low-income countries in line with the principles of joint action and fair burden sharing and other initiatives. At the same time, middle and low-income countries offer excellent opportunities for investment in infrastructure, and hence private capital and its expertise and efficiency could help to close the infrastructure gap in these countries. The private sector has a central role to impose gender issues within their own staff in developing countries, as Francine and Bjarne told us, and in this way set a good example in gender equality and diversity and the empowerment of women, including their leadership, at the core of efforts to advance women's economic participation and girls' education, which are critical to economic growth. At the global level, income and wealth are continually concentrating, and something has to be done. International tax reform is important to provide resources to governments to invest in economic recovery, climate action, and SDGs. The introduction of global minimum tax and taxation of the digital economy are welcome reform principles. In this regard, my question is, what does the panel consider about corporations redistributing some of the tax payments on profits to the host countries? Thank you, Caroline.
Fascinating question, and really one that has been at a global narrative and discussion point by Secretary Treasury here in the United States, Janet Yellen. So really thinking about how corporates could perhaps proactively redistribute their payments and profit into certain countries in particular where we haven't seen as much equality, empowerment, and certainly in certain areas had some concern around the economic stability. I want to now bring it to Dr. Ricardo, I understand, in Colombia. So we move from Argentina to Colombia to try and return to Dr. Ricardo, who I think has his question ready now. Dr. Ricardo, if you could unmute. No, we'll give him a moment. Now we'll move to... Oh, there we are. Hello.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, babe. Excuse me, for my connection is not really well right now. That's why it's really important to work together with the private sector to to engage our commitment for the new technology implementation in our country. That's why public cooperation models are not only possible, but also necessary for the emerging economies of Latin America, especially in Latin America and in Africa. As a university, we have the great challenge of mediating between the approaches of the private sector and the real needs of the regional context and public policies that often lack a shared vision. That's why we would like to ask all of our speakers, how is the relationship between the companies and the higher education institutions to ensure the social responsible development on the region where we are located, when they are located right now, and how can improve their strategy to be more justice with the people of those regional areas, and also how can improve the innovation between relations, the university and the own company.
I love that question, Dr. Ricardo. Thank you very much for battling your infrastructure, internet and infrastructure there. And it is wonderful to be able to get your question really asking about how to improve the strategy when it comes to relationships between companies, the private sector, and particular higher education institutions to ensure that we do have a responsible and socially responsible allocation to and indeed sharing of innovations between the two. Let's lastly move it on to Charles Boateng. I'm pleased to say that he can be joining us at the moment. So if, of course, Charles Boateng can be joining us from Ghana at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon from Ghana. I'm pleased to be part of this discussion. I think discussions about how the private sector supports the drive to maintain a good environment is very important. Mine is, I think, is a question. The need for the private sector to continue to support or to focus on profit making cannot be overemphasized, looking at the kind of role that they play in economic development of the world, and more importantly in Africa, when it comes to their support in terms of the tax or income generated by the government, job creation, poverty reduction. I think their role is very important, and they need profit to generate it. So normally in Africa, when you are pushing the private sector to other areas that they can contribute, they are normally shying away from it. So in as much as I believe that they have to go into that direction, I think that to be able to push the private sector to support how to protect the environment, we should be in a position to incentivize them, because they are going to trade off, or there's going to be an opportunity cost to let go of the profit that they are going to forgo. So my question is, what are the measures, or what are some of the incentives that globally are being put together to help the private sector to be able to support our drive to protect the environment? I think rules and regulations, unfortunately, have not worked so perfectly, especially in Africa, because of the role that corruption has played. When you leave activities, or when you leave people to do things based on how they are regulated by rules, normally they pay their way out. So how can they be incentivized to be able to support that drive to protect the globe or the environment? So that is my question. Thank you very much.
A wonderful question. Thank you, Charles Boateng. I'm really talking about the incentives that have worked globally to ensure that private companies do come and invest in certain parts of the country. And I think on that note, we should return to our first speaker, if he's not returned to watching what I'm sure is a thrilling cricket match at the same time. Siobhan, if you're online, just give us a little sense of what you've seen work, where you've seen government incentives perhaps bring about change, bring about investment from the private sector that might not otherwise have occurred.
Yeah, thank you. Well, quick update on the cricket, and I noticed there's a Pakistani, I think Dr. Naveed. Unfortunately for you, there's rain, and the cricket match has been stalled for the moment, but your team has performed very well against India. So fingers crossed.
And we have the same thought for you.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so look, I mean, is it really a choice? Engaging with communities and building that trust with the communities in which the private sector operates in isn't a choice anymore. And particularly with the company that I represent, which is a very large conglomerate with businesses in a vast array and different spheres of in areas of business, it's not an option anymore at all. And in fact, the fact that we have very strong roots in the community, which are built on trust. So the most important thing here is all of us and all of the people that we represent. The only thing everyone is looking for is opportunity. Isn't that true? Isn't even the fact that we're all on this panel here is the fact that we're looking for an opportunity. It doesn't matter how young or old we are. And I think that's one string that's a chord that sort of runs throughout all of our communities. And that's the trust that we must endeavor to win with our communities. And the way to do that, I believe, is through a sincere effort to engage with the challenges faced by these communities. You may fail. In all probability, you will fail more times than you succeed. But each company would probably be able to come up with a style and a model that is endemic to that particular challenge and problem and Sorry about that. I think I just got a call. And I think that, yeah, I'm back. But I think that effort, that sincere effort to engage with communities and build trust and it absolutely will result in success and prosperity to a company that is looking to expand. And we've seen it happen in droves to us here in Sri Lanka. As everybody knows, Sri Lanka went through economic turmoil last year.
Yeah.
Moving out of that crisis has required the private sector particularly to take a very, very active role in the resurgence of the Sri Lankan economy. And there's no way we can do that by thinking, in traditional ways.
I think that pivots us nicely. Dr. Bjorn, if you can weigh in, I mean, this might be a question for your CFO, but you as CEO of in Denmark of Siemens, when you're thinking of, new ways of thinking from the private sector to gain trust, some of that comes down to taxing your profits. And I think the question coming from Professor Lashinsky over in Argentina is an interesting one about redistributing payments and profits. Bjorn, have you thought about that particularly? Is that something that you come to the table on, or is this more about ensuring that you're making R&D and investments in a smart way that clearly is evident that you're giving back to communities?
Thanks for the question. I think that big multinational companies like Siemens have a big responsibility to make sure that you really, in these countries where you are creating the value add, also pay the taxes. And I think that is a part of being a good corporate citizens. And by the way, also the degree program I talked about before. And I think there is a big responsibility to make sure that you really also is contributing in these countries. And there was actually one question which was also a little bit into that one. And that was a little bit like, if I must add on that one, it was regarding this decarbonization and coming out that it hits specific area in the world. Africa, we were getting a good example there. And there I also think that actually gives, that we really need to work together as companies and society to come in the direction of decarbonization, because the bad thing about decarbonization is it creates an even more not equal world. So it's actually pushing that one because it's hitting in different directions, and therefore I think that is really important, that we're working on how can we solve that. And then regarding the tax thing coming back, I think it's very important that we as multinational companies are paying taxes distributed in the world. So I think that is. There was one, if I must be so free, there was a really good question coming from some of them. Yes, about this with cooperation with universities. And if I must take my freedom to comment on that one, is that I think then as a big responsibility to have cooperation with universities in different countries. And I think that this work together with universities and companies can create a lot of value. In Siemens, we have formalized programs where we work together with university, but it also comes back to the personal responsibility. For example, I'm a supervisor for some PhD students, and I think that is my way, as personal way, as working here, try to help. And by the way, it's not in Denmark, it's in Indonesia. So this way, so we're also trying to create this cooperation and support between universities and business, which I think is so important and a big part of the society. So there's just a comment on that one, and sorry for being all over the place, Caroline.
No, I think you did such a wonderful way of interlinking all the questions and taking us on that journey. And I think you really spoke to Dr. Errol Norman's particular point when it came to decarbonization. And immediately when he said hydrogen, I thought that's an interesting one for Siemens. But Fran, I also thought his point, Dr. Errold's point, was really interesting in terms of, well, capital flight, but also talent flight, the brain drain. And I know you mentioned that Cisco has been thinking about projects in the African continent, ensuring that you're able to train and give digital expertise to other countries, to other populations. How are you thinking about that in particular when Dr. Errold was saying, like, how can they particularly see companies support universities in particular parts of sub-Saharan Africa in particular?
I had the privilege this summer to work 7 weeks in sub-Saharan Africa. And so Dr. Errold's question was with me as I was thinking about it. So I think the first thing that I would say is absolutely, I think for all of us, partnerships with universities are absolutely critical. And something that we benefit from and desperately need from a private sector perspective. What I have seen recently that I think is really helpful is that more and more companies are partnering with universities on apprenticeships, which is a beautiful way for students to get experiences before they graduate, allows them to understand different types of companies, perhaps multinationals, and build some of the skill and capability, which I think sometimes is just like even the vocabulary and the communication. And so anything that we can do around partnership there, I think is important. The other thing that I would say is from a Cisco perspective, we have partnerships around the world with universities that are really targeted more from an innovation perspective and work that we can do together. I do think to Dr. Errold's point, this has to be a big part of the solve. But as I've been listening to the really hard questions, which I think are so good, something that I just keep thinking about is that there isn't one company that can solve the issues that we're talking about. And I think sometimes the fact that all of us from a corporate perspective have these individual projects, I don't think serve countries or even universities well. And so the more and more that we can create these ecosystems so that we can pool resources and drive to shared outcomes, I think that's going to be incredibly important for us as we move forward as well. The only other thing that I would share as I was just listening is that we can't forget that at the moment there's immense power with consumers and employees in looking at companies that are doing good from a sustainability, social justice, digital skills perspective. I do think as it relates to the environmental projects that we're talking about, knowing that consumers are looking for customers that are companies that are doing good, I do think is something that we can lean into. When I was in Africa, what I heard again and again is that please don't come to me from an environmental perspective with the stick, come to me from a carrot perspective. And what that means is we have to find these projects that we can work on together that really yield the big breakthroughs as it relates to our carbon footprint or our achieving net zero.
Yeah. How amazing to have been using your expertise just as you spent 7 weeks in sub-Saharan Africa. So absolutely wonderful to share that journey. And we've got some now incredible questions coming from the audience. So thank you, audience, for being so engaged. And what's so great is that these perfectly suit both Fran and indeed Dr. Bjarne. And Dr. Bjarne, I'm going to go to you first because this comes from Indonesia, and you just said that you have, relationships with students in Indonesia, and you're helping them in terms of their own doctorates. And Dee Dahaya from Indonesia says, how do you see the future of the workforce when machine and artificial intelligence are predicted to replace many labor jobs? Will countries like Indonesia that will have the demographic dividends at the moment in the near future still have a promising potential in labor and market in this increased era of productivity? So Dr. Bjarne, I'm sure you're hearing that anxiety from some of the students that you talk with.
Yes, and I think it's a super good question. Thanks for that one. And if you look into Europe, we have the problem that we actually is lacking workforce. So I think it's really a great gift to Indonesia that Indonesia still will have, a very young population, and by the way, also a still growing population. And I must say that I strongly believe that even we get AI, it could be it will replace some jobs. It will probably also create some new jobs. I think the interesting stuff is always to think about that many of us have jobs now that did not exist 30 years ago. So sometimes when you think about it, Denmark 100 years ago, 90% of the population was in agriculture work. And now 100 years back, it's 3% of the population. So you could say that the 90% of the job disappeared because of the automation in the agriculture sector. And you know, you do see something here with AI also. But I think actually it's advantages for Indonesia that they have a young population. And I don't think I actually don't think it'll be a problem. There will be a lot of new jobs created. Some of them we'll sit here and we don't even know what the new jobs will come. And then some jobs will disappear. And that comes back to what we talked about. We need to have a growth mindset, all of us, and then take the opportunities. And I think there came a good comment down here. What do all people want? They want an opportunity. And I think there will be many opportunities coming. So I will not be worried. There will come many new jobs, and Indonesia is perhaps in a better situation than in Europe and many other countries where we have a problem that our workforce will go down in the next year to come. Thanks.
Fran, you must be hearing so much as Chief People Officer, the anxiety from your own internal employees at the moment and people that you speak to who want to come and work for Cisco. How do you see a future where we continue to have an augmentation of humanity rather than us becoming obsolete in the world of AI?
Yeah, I completely agree with Dr. Bjorn. I think that there's tremendous opportunity. I do think we have to be realistic and know that jobs, and I think even I would say subsets of jobs will be impacted, but in that there is opportunity. I will tell you, Caroline, like I would say 9 months ago when we were talking about AI, I think the first response from employees was, uh-oh. And I think over the last 9 months, what they're seeing is that this intelligence is actually going to make us better and actually allow many of their roles to scale. As an example, we leverage AI in our first-line technical support area. And what that means is that some of our employees that were providing first-level support are now providing second-level support. And so I do think we have to look at it this way. What is behind AI is an incredible focus on data. And so to some of the questions that we heard just a moment ago, I would say from a university perspective, strength and leadership in data and analytics will be such a differentiator. And there will be so many companies that are born out of this area. And so I think both for our students, but also for the startup environment, this focus will be incredibly meaningful. I think the last thing that I would say is that our roles have been impacted by technology for the last many decades. And understanding that and now doing our part to anticipate some of those changes and then consequently the skills and capabilities that we need, I think that's how you reduce some of the anxiety and really get clear on the plan around what skills do our people need to be ready for the next chapter. And I think the next chapter, by the way, is only like 2 or 3 years. I don't think it's 10 years. We just don't know.
Well said. It's coming thick and fast at us. And we've got one thick and fast question coming from our audience, and it's a great one. It's aimed at you, Fran, but I'm sure Dr. Brown can weigh in as well. Anna Matros Goreses from Namibia asks, how do you measure your impact to the people? What measures do you put in place to measure the purpose statement that you have in terms of impact? How are you having this wonderful feedback from your own employees?
Yeah, so we do our best to measure everything. And I do think we're going to get better at this. And so earlier I shared that we can see that 85% of our people are giving back to the community. When issues come up, something that I look at is I look to see, is this an issue that our employees care about? If it is, I'm more willing to lean in from a corporate perspective. A beautiful example of this is there's this organization called Covenant House, and they help teenagers who unfortunately are out on the streets, who do not have a home, find a safe place, get education, the support, the therapy that they need. Our employees found this organization. They started sleeping out in support of Covenant House. And then we as a company started to match their investments. And so we have put millions and millions into this organization. So I think you have to listen to your employees. The other thing that we measure is how many people are we touching? So I shared that we've trained 17.5 million students. That's okay, but I think the real measure is how many of those students get jobs. that allow them to build a career in technology. And so I would say over the last 5 to 7 years, we've been tracking that. Our number is around 90% of people that take a Net Academy course load are now getting jobs in technology.
Wow. 90% of 1.7 million.
90% over the last 5 years, so not the full 17
Wow.
point. But yes, I mean, that is what we have to really look at and measure. We're looking at, for the dollars that we invest in startups, to what extent are they able to accelerate or grow? And so I would say this is an area where you're going to see more and more focus. We, of course, measure our inclusion and diversity. Dr. Bjarne mentioned that up front. How is our representation as a company evolving? What does the leadership of the company look like? These are all things that we're measuring, but I think maybe more importantly, we're sharing transparently in our purpose report. And I think maybe that's the big call out is, I think all of us from a company perspective have to share the good and the bad numbers, which is not easy to do. Some of the numbers that we share, I'm not happy with where they are, but I think that's the starting point of a journey, is to admit that this is an area where you have to improve and then do the work to drive that improvement.
And Siobhan, I understand you're actually still with us, I'm pleased to say. So can you weigh in a little bit on how you've been measuring your own impact for a moment? I'm sure that that's something that you've been focused on in terms of ensuring that the people that you touch, it can be measured, the data is there.
Absolutely. And one idea is to also expand your partnerships to include academia. Something that I've experienced is partnering with universities and bringing in university students to data collection, data gathering, analysis, etc., and also somehow engaging in young people, particularly as volunteers, into the entire process. Helps certainly measure not only the impact of what you're doing, or also tells you what you should be doing. That's an incredibly important factor, particularly when you are dealing with a country like Sri Lanka, where there's a myriad problems to be resolved, so many challenges. How do you obviously allocate very scarce resources correctly and impactfully is a massive question. And so to measure what you should be doing is also important. So very quickly, something that we've done very successfully over the past decade is we do this thing called the door-to-door walkabout. So we literally, the journalists from our newsroom, walk the length and breadth of Sri Lanka once a year for about 2 months. Visit as many villages as possible with a couple of universities, and then we prepare a report. It's the data in this report that we then put out to the public and say, these are the problems that we'd like to tackle. Would you like to support us? So it might sound very simple, but essentially it gives us a foundation, a very solid grounding in data, which is essentially the truth. And so even when it comes to politics, you know, in countries like Sri Lanka, politics is very closely, I guess everywhere in the world, politics is very closely connected to organizations like mine, particularly the media. But the fact that we're based and grounded and founded on the truth makes it very difficult for anybody to question our efforts, and also builds a whole lot of trust with ordinary people, which makes the whole effort that far wider, more expansive, and more well accepted than simply a company doing CSR, which is certainly not something that we're interested in at all. I hope I've made sense and you can hear what I'm saying, because I can't even hear myself.
You hear you perfectly. We sound perfect, and really fascinating story of how people are making real impact, literally walking the walk and not just figuratively walking the walk. At that note, I want to really start to wrap up this conversation and give a huge thanks for the expertise that we've heard and for the incredible questions that have come not only from academia, from think tanks, but notably from you, the audience, as well. So with that, I do want to give a huge thanks to Siobhan Daniel there. We'll let him get back to whether the cricket starts again and let him think. But thank you, Siobhan Daniel, of course, for the Sri Lanka expertise there. Dr. Bjarne Sorensen, coming from Denmark, the CEO of Siemens in Denmark there. And Francine Katsudas, of course, is the Executive Vice President and Chief People Policy and Purpose Officer of Cisco, getting up early for us in California. But also our incredible discussants. We've had Dr. Ricardo from Colombia. We've had Professor Mohammed coming to us from Pakistan. We've had Dr. Errol coming from Namibia. Professor Bernardo coming to us from Argentina. And Charles Boateng, of course, coming from Ghana. To all of you, we thank you. And with that, we hand it back to what has been an incredible marathon of discussions with the Global Town Hall.